All right, hello everybody. I'm Ron Payne. I am the president of the Otter Creek Audubon Society. This is the surprise third Cabin Fever Lecture Series event we're holding this year. Um, we had two, and then this one just came up, and it's nice to do three because that's what we normally do every year. I just give you a quick update on Otter Creek Audubon stuff. We're still not doing in-person events. We're following government guidelines, and they're talking about opening up, but we'll see how it goes. But hopefully sometime in the summer, we will be able to get back to doing that again. Or definitely in the fall. So looking forward to that. So tonight, our speaker is Kevin Tolan, staff biologist and grassland bird outreach coordinator from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. And he's going to be telling us tonight about a new project for monitoring and coming up with some possible solutions for managing and helping out Eastern Meadowlarks. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Kevin Tolan.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be talking to everyone. We have a nice sized group here, so I hope we can facilitate some questions and discussion later. First off, in Vermont, we talk about land management a lot. The first land managers, of course, were the Abenaki people. So I just want to recognize that whenever I'm talking about land management, that's a very short-sighted kind of point of view of things compared to what's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years before. So I just want to recognize that we are on their ancestral land, and we should treat it with respect as such. We have quite a few grassland birds in Vermont. Most people think of the bobolink and the Savannah sparrow, sometimes the meadowlark, maybe if you get up to Franklin County Airport, grasshopper sparrow, but I mean, how many people have Henslow sparrow on their Vermont list? It's not many, and sedge wrens are a really rare occurrence. And that's really kind of shown by their level of threatenedness in Vermont. Of our, 8 grassland bird obligate nesters, almost over half of them are threatened and endangered. Meadowlarks are up for listing this year. I'd be surprised if they didn't go through. So that's a pretty sizable portion of our grassland nesters that historically have nested in Vermont. And I say historically because there hasn't been a Henslow sparrow listing or a sighting or breeding record, or I guess more breeding record since like the 1980s. So they haven't bred here in 40 years, which is really unfortunate that we're losing avifauna from Vermont's landscape. And it's kind of odd that I'm talking about Vermont's. Sorry, let me answer a quick question. What about Nelsons and LeContes? So Nelsons, they breed more in like marshy kind of marshes, saltwater marshes, occasionally freshwater. I don't know if we have any breeding records of them. I don't think we have any breeding records of LeContes. Those are a lot more Midwestern. They didn't really make it over here as much as Henslow's did. But yeah, so I'm talking about these grassland birds, and I just mentioned there, that they made it over here from the Midwest. And when we think of grasslands, that's what we think of. We think of the Midwest. We think of these really expansive prairies, but they can even be more expansive than we think. We think of the classic, Kansas, Oklahoma prairie, but the Chihuahuan Desert, that's a kind of a prairie ecosystem. The Basin Steppe that's in Nevada, that's a kind of a prairie-ish ecosystem. And when we take these illustrations from people out in Missouri, we see a lot of these same species. We see bobolink, we see that's a northern harrier back there. This is, I think, a LeConte, but it could be another one of those, little brown birds. So it is kind of an oxymoron that we talk about grasslands in Vermont, and that I spend so much time talking about them. And the reason that I'm talking about to you guys now is about the meadowlark, which is undergoing extremely sharp population declines region-wide and statewide, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But just some basic background ecology for them. They are found throughout a lot of the eastern United States. They are usually either a resident or a short/mid-distance migrant. And I'll show you a map of that in a second as well. Something that's really interesting about their range limits is that they won't overwinter in areas with a winter average temperature of less than 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of an interesting thing. Like, what does that 15-degree Fahrenheit threshold really mean? It's definitely a cold temperature that's going to limit where they can find food and appropriate habitat. But that's it's a pretty interesting statistic. I think that hard limit isn't as much their range. It's where can they find those habitats that are going to be at least 15 degrees Fahrenheit in, an average that in mid-January. And throughout most of Vermont, that's probably not going to happen. Down the road, who knows if we'll be able to link changes in average temperatures to these guys' northward movement. They have a varied migration. When we think of a lot of our migratory species, such as warblers or bobolinks, they all have a pretty similar, within each species, they all migrate relatively similar. They'll overwinter in the same general areas. With bobolinks, they all basically take the same southward path until they reach southern South America, and then they all migrate northward together. Right now, they're probably passing through Brazil, I'd imagine. They're getting toward the northern tip of South America. But Eastern Meadowlarks don't have such a strong affinity to one particular migration pathway. This is research done by Jason Hill, who's one of my current colleagues, and Roz Renfrew, who's the one of VC's co-founders. And these are 3 different individuals tagged with little geolocators in various areas of their range. And the orange path is their fall migration route, and the green path is their assumed northward migration route. And even in this relatively small geographic area of, a couple states, one of them traveled, 5 times the distance of others. And then we look at this Massachusetts one, it traveled down to Maryland, but there were also 2 birds in Maryland that didn't leave their breeding grounds throughout the season. So they were essentially a resident of their area, which is kind of interesting when you have different species, or you have the same species that are demonstrating different migratory strategies, because there are pros and cons to migrating versus not migrating. If you don't migrate, pros, you can probably hold your territory a little bit better because you're there year round. You don't need to waste all that energy on migration. But cons, you're going through colder winter temperatures, which are going to take, they're going to take a lot of energy to keep your body heat maintained, to find food if it's covered in snow. But on the flip side, if you are a migratory individual, you have to really sprint northward to get to the breeding grounds quickly to try and establish a territory. And of course, you're wasting a lot of energy flying those extra hundreds of miles, but you're avoiding, a cold, coastal Massachusetts winter. So there are definitely kind of 2 different strategies that are employed within the same species. Something else I think is really interesting about the meadowlarks is how, when you look at a map of the grasslands, you can see a really strong correlation between the edge of the meadowlark, or the Eastern Meadowlarks range, and where it transitions to shortgrass prairie. Up here, it's mostly tall grass and mixed prairie. Down here in Texas, we do start getting a little bit more shortgrass. And then there's also populations in the Chihuahuan Desert. The subspecies down here is the Lillian's meadowlark, which is a really cool subspecies. Might be considered a its entire own species at some point. And they just have a slightly paler look to them than most other meadowlarks. But throughout this gradient, there's a very wide range of habitat, right? Goes from shrubby desert to tall grass, prairie, which is pretty interesting compared to a lot of the species that we get up here in Vermont. Where I think of chestnut-sided warbler, it's a pretty consistent habitat throughout most of its breeding range. Going for that shrubby kind of early successional, early growth shrubland. These guys, they're all in grasslands of some sort, but it differs quite a bit the type of grassland, and that's, I think, partially due, or mainly due, to how widespread they are in their breeding range from north to south compared to being from east to west. Because here they're covering a bunch of different ecotones and ecosystems, whereas bobolinks, which nest kind of straddling the US-Canadian border, they're all pretty much at the same latitude. So they're gonna have pretty similar vegetation throughout a lot of their range. One other thing I want to touch on is Eastern versus Western meadowlarks. They do have a zone of hybridization that I'll touch on in a second. And it's kind of interesting that these guys used to be, one species until the 1903, the early 1910s, is when most organizations started recognizing them as one species. And it's kind of easy to see why they were considered one species. They have very minimal differences in appearance between them. The major one is that the Western has a yellow malar, kind of like cheeks, whereas the Eastern has white. And there are a couple of their subtle differences. But other than song, it's really kind of hard to tell them apart, especially at a distance. And so I think Lewis and Clark might have actually made mention of the differing songs, but they didn't make the jump to different species. And that was only done within the past 100, 110, 115 years. And they have a surprisingly wide range of hybridization. Hybridization is rare. In captivity, they've done some experiments where it's been a little bit more common, but it's still rare in nature. Even though there's this pretty large overlap zone of hybridization. The hybrids, when they hybridize, the offspring are alive. They're called F1 hybrids, or like the first generation, but they have a greatly reduced reproductive output, especially if they are paired with another hybrid offspring. So there's not like a long lineage of hybrids, such as there is with blue-winged and golden-winged warblers. So you have the Lawrence warbler, and it's not its own species, obviously, but it's kind of a distinctive individual that continues to breed. These hybrids don't have that same sustainable viability for reproduction. So I've been talking about meadowlarks on that large scale a lot, but I'm really here to kind of promote and talk about meadowlarks in the Northeast, especially in Vermont, of course. In Vermont, they are mostly centered in the Champlain Valley, a couple up here in Franklin County, and they overwinter, almost entirely along the Massachusetts southward Atlantic coast. So, that is again that's because of that 15-degree Fahrenheit limit for their southward, or their winter northernmost limit, but also back before European colonization, the indigenous people were burning heavily along the coast, and a lot more heavily than they were in Vermont. So these are more historically open areas that have been burned for much longer than just the past 300 years. So that's been more of a historical breeding ground for these grassland birds compared to areas in Vermont, which were mostly cleared in the 1800s. When we look at Vermont, again, they're focused in the Champlain Valley. That's where almost all the hay is. This map on the right, the yellow, shows hay over 10 hectares in Vermont, which is kind of like what I'm considering the edge of meadowlark suitable habitat. They're very area sensitive. And so when the land was cleared almost entirely in Vermont in the 1800s, and it was like 80% grass. These species were everywhere. 80% of the landscape was covered in grasslands. Those are large, unbroken tracts of great habitat for grassland birds that are managed very heavily to maintain them in the grass-like state, rather than allowing them to begin growing woody vegetation or be transitioned to a row crop. Because during those days when sheep was the major economic agricultural driver, early successful shrub habitat wouldn't do much. They wanted that really good hay. And since then, of course, the numbers have been reversed. Now the landscape is much more forest than hayfield. And with that loss in habitat and the change in management came large losses in our grassland bird populations. When you look at, so on the left is eBird sightings of meadowlark for the past 10 years throughout the breeding season. And it really correlates well with the grasslands. There are exceptions, of course, like down here in Southeast Vermont, there's a breeding group, but there's not a whole ton of grassland. But for the most part, they have moved almost entirely into the Champlain Valley. During the Breeding Bird Atlas, which was in the 1980s, only 27% of the meadowlarks found were in the Champlain Valley. 25 years later, during the next Breeding Bird Atlas, over 55% were found in the Champlain Valley. So it's a really heavy population shift to the Champlain Valley. And there's also been a massive drop in that population as well. And this just really well illustrates the opposite effect that a high, a relative density of forest has on grassland birds. This is New England wildlife over the past 400 years. After European colonization, the forest greatly reduced. Wolves became, extirpated. Deer were gone, beaver were gone. The one thing that was up was grassland birds, because the forest was gone and all these other species were gone. As soon as the forest began reclaiming the landscape, the meadowlarks, bobolinks started dropping off, and all the other species started coming back. And this is New England, but it's echoed across the U.S. and Canada. We've heard that study. Billions of birds lost in the past 100 years, past decade. 72 million predicted were grassland birds since 1970. Over a 50% population drop. And grassland birds are actually the fastest declining group of species in the continental US. So that'll exclude stuff like Hawaiian endemics, which are, it makes me sad to think about how fast those are going extinct. But other than those, for the most part, grassland birds are undergoing the biggest decline in the US, Canada. Another kind of interesting thing to notice that's a little bit off tangent, but the only group that's predicted to definitely be rising is wetlands, because that's a lot of waterfowl and ducks. And of course, throughout the 60s and 70s, a lot more hunting regulations, EPA regulations to help protect the prairie pothole region. So that's really a good success story of how a lot of public engagement can turn a group that's really losing a lot of their population to actually having a net gain. And groups like Ducks Unlimited and other hunting conservation groups like that have done a fantastic job with that. I was talking to some of your members earlier, and like that's something that they were like, yeah, I think that'd be an interesting thing to kind of use as a model for grassland work. And they're totally right. I think that there's potential in that for a wetland bird duck-esque conservation effort for grasslands. When I say that meadowlark are declining, it's not an understatement. The map on the right is 1966 through 2019 from the Breeding Bird Survey, which is done by the USGS. And the relative abundance is at zero. like you could say it's at 0.5 or at 1, but it's basically at 0, which is pretty similar to the other species of endangered grassland birds we have that are now completely gone from the landscape, if not almost gone from the landscape. So I'm genuinely concerned that if we don't do anything in the next 5-10 years, they are going to be off the landscape with a decline that fast, 8.7% annual decline in Vermont. They're not going to be here in another 15 years if we don't start doing more to try and keep them on the landscape. The standardized breeding bird survey atlas methods are done every 25 years in Vermont. On the left is the first breeding bird atlas, which was 1976 through 81. And the right is the second atlas, 2003 through 2007. There's some big changes you can see, but I think they're shown best when you overlay the maps onto each other. All of these blue squares were places that had breeding meadowlarks in 76 to 81, but didn't have them in 03 to 07. So that's over half the blocks lost occupancy of meadowlarks. One other thing is, as I mentioned, they become a lot more central in the Champlain Valley. If you if you just look kind of like at the Champlain Valley area, in the second breeding bird atlas, they did gain net block, right? There's in the Champlain Valley now than there were in the first. However, overall, there's a large decrease of 55% of blocks between the first and second breeding bird atlases, 25 years apart. If we're waiting until the next breeding bird atlas won't be till 2030, 2032 or something like that, which will be way too late for a lot of the conservation that's needed for these species. I'm just going to touch on habitat requirements and some management stuff for a second, and then I'll move over to the Blitz and some other Blitz type stuff, and then hopefully we'll be able to open up to some questions or comments, whatever. Field size and shape are of utmost importance for grassland species. They really need that interior area in the fields. Even if the fields are relatively similar sized, a big blocky field is going to have a lot more interior area than smaller fields. And that's what the grassland birds like, which is why they like these larger parcels of grasslands. The larger the grassland, the more interior area. And so the general rule is that 5 hectares is the minimum size for meadowlarks, which is about 10 football fields. Really, I'd say 10 is probably like a better, a safer guess. But they're encountered twice as much in fields 20 to 100 hectares than they are in fields that are 10 hectares, and then 5 is the minimum. So if they're encountered twice as much in these larger pastures and larger fields, the odds of them being in a small 5-hectare field is relatively low because of how area sensitive these species are. Another really important thing is the configuration of the landscape. If your field is only 5 hectares, but it's connected to 100 hectares of other fields, the bird's going to see just a 100-hectare field. They're not going to look on the parcel level and kind of divvy up, oh, well, that's only a 10-acre parcel, but it's right next to a 5-acre parcel. They look on the large spatial scale of hundreds of acres of surrounding fields. So even though a field may be, bigger, if it's not surrounded by other fields, A, it's hard for a bird to, get there, and B, they're not going to have the same sense of openness and lack of edge that they would in a larger field environment. And that really mirrors, their Midwestern roots. In the Midwest, there's not trees every 500 feet blocking their view. It's an endless view of the meadow from sea to shining sea, basically. So when we're trying to emulate their landscape here, we're trying to kind of almost emulate the landscape in the Midwest. And a big reason we care about these guys in Vermont is because they're undergoing a very bad decline range wide. We should be able to at least try and conserve them here, where we have the opportunity to try and protect them from, going the way of so many other species that have left the state or have just had massive population and range declines. One other important consideration is the vegetation. I would not call either of these suitable habitat for a meadowlark. The left is very fern dominated. Usually when I see that, I also usually think wet. So I think it'd probably be a little bit wet for meadowlarks or bobolinks or other grassland birds. And there's just not nearly enough grass in it. Birds, they really, really need and want grass. And kind of on the right, it's a little too shrubby. There's too many wildflowers. It looks like they might have kind of woody-ish stems, definitely woody shrubs popping up in the background. And again, not much grass at all. So I would not even bother looking for grassland birds in those environments. What they really want are these large, wide open, sorry, let's erase that. These large, wide open, grassland dominated landscapes. This is in Shelburne, nearby to Shelburne Farm. Gorgeous field, nudie vegetation except for that hedgerow, especially on a slight hill like that. That's very preferable because the view shed is so much larger than if you were on, a lowland or a flat section, which again helps emulate those wide open environments in the Midwest. They have, interesting breeding requirements though, because obviously birds in Vermont are going to breed differently than birds in the Chihuahuan Desert. So this is very Vermont, Northeast, Wisconsin-esque focused. In Maine, they actually breed in blueberry barrens. So there's a pretty wide range of their habitat use for breeding. But in Vermont, in our context, basically they're looking for these large, 10, 20 football field sized grasslands that are majority grass, majority hay. I don't want to get everyone down too much, so I'm only going to briefly touch on the threats that these guys are, experiencing. Obviously, birds everywhere are under massive threats, historic threats, and these being the fastest declining group of birds in the continental U.S. is no exception. One of the main drivers is increasing intensity of haying management. I mentioned that sheep were the dominant agricultural animal in the 1800s. In Vermont, that's now dairy. Dairy cattle need much more nutrient-rich hay than sheep or goats or even beef cattle or draft horses. This graph on the left shows the yield, how much, the weight that you're getting over time for a second cut. And obviously, if you wait more time, you're going to have a higher yield after your first cut. But if you're haying and you need very nutrient-rich hay, and you're going to want to get it at the peak of its feed value, which is just basically the nutrient value of it. And if you wait, 1 week, you're losing 1/10 of the nutrient content. And if you wait 2 weeks, you're losing 40% of the nutrient content, which isn't good, A, if you have dairy cattle, or B, if you're trying to resell it on a market that needs high quality forage. And 28 days is not nearly enough time for birds or for the grass to grow back, for the birds to recolonize, for the birds to remate, to build new nests, to lay their eggs and fledge their young. So as we've transitioned to more of this dairy agricultural economy, the frequency of haying has greatly increased. In some places, 3 or 4 times plus a year. In those environments, there is 0% chance of any fledging going on. I can say that almost unequivocally, that unless by some miracle, the patch, the 5 feet diameter patch is missed where the nest happens to be, but that's so unlikely. It's basically 0%. And then, as with lost species, habitat loss is another massive issue. Vermont's undergoing a bit of a housing boom right now. Property values are going up. Probably people can be looking to move here in the upcoming years. And if you have a massive, beautiful lakeside, hilly landscape like this, and someone comes along and a contractor, someone offers you an obscene amount, and you take it, it's going to be subdivided up. It's never going to, turn back into a hayfield, and it's always going to be smaller parcels than before. So as development occurs, it makes the grassland parcels smaller and smaller, which is not good for these species that like that interior area. And once it's developed, it's never going to go back to a hayfield, because that just doesn't make economic sense to transition a developed area to a hayfield that isn't going to have nearly as much economic growth to it. Additionally, as the dairy industry, they're undergoing a bit of a dairy crisis right now. They've had sustained really low milk prices that are below operating costs for the past few years. And so as that declines and continues to industrialize, the hayfields are going to be continually industrialized as well, which feeds back into the intensive haying part. And then, of course, just general, habitat degradation, fragmentation, all that is, of course, recipe for disaster. And then just kind of showing how sustained this habitat loss is. All of this, so this is, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois. All of this tannish color is tall grass prairie that has been lost. These little fragments right here are the only parcels of pure tall grass prairie that are native, that haven't been replanted really. So that's a massive area that's been lost of prime habitat. In the Kansas, Oklahoma region, which is kind of like their central breeding core, there's less than a 25% chance that population is sustainable. And in Vermont, the acres of grassland have lost over, we've lost over 100,000 acres of grazed farmland in Vermont in just 20 years, which is astounding. And then, of course, you break that all into, being fragmented and smaller parcels and fewer parcels farther apart. And just the habitat has gone from peak habitat 200 years ago to very, very little quality habitat for these species that require large pieces of grassland habitat. And then, of course, also the obligatory outdoor cats are not good. Put window decals on to help prevent window strikes. And another kind of interesting thing that a lot of people might not think about is that in the Vermont landscape that's so agricultural for so many of these large hayfields, near these human settlements, there is going to be increased predation. You have all that feed and food and water and waste all around. There's going to be more rats and more possums and more skunks and more raccoons. And all those are predators on these grassland birds, since they do nest on the ground. And so in the Vermont landscape, where it's a very agricultural, grassland area, the predation levels are much higher than in the Midwest, where there may not be human settlements for hundreds, thousands of acres from the native grasslands. So that's just another artifact of the fragmentation on our landscape. And then just management quickly, I mentioned that management for these guys is incredibly important, and that's mostly because of when the fields are cut. The left axis here is the cumulative percent of birds fledged. So here 100% have fledged, here 0%. And it really does take almost the entire summer to reach a cumulative 100% fledgling rate. So if you're cutting right in early July, 60% of Savannah sparrows might fledge, maybe, depending on your region. I'm pretty sure this is all Shelburne, Champlain Valley. If you do that, in the Upper Valley or near Newport, or maybe even up, in Franklin County, those dates are going to be pushed back even more. And when you're trying to get as much out of a growing season you can, those pushbacks are just more and more detrimental to both your bottom line and any livestock you may have. Which is why we really encourage people, if you can, to wait until at least July 15th, ideally August 1st, to cut your hay. If you're in the Champlain Valley, you could cut before June 1st and wait 65 days, which would put you kind of right in early August. However, that's very region dependent. They've tried that in Ontario, I believe, and it didn't work. They wouldn't re-nest after that. But at least in Shelburne, when they've tried it, they've had some luck re-nesting. But of course, the wait until August 1st, mow every year or 2 or 3 is definitely kind of like the gold standard for bird-friendly hay management. I also kind of want to touch on some mowing strategies that aren't just good for grassland birds, but are really just good for almost all animals, is to prevent corralling species in the middle by mowing in, knocking them all out with one fell swoop. If you think about hay fields, yes, you have birds, you also have mammals and snakes and frogs and insects. And so if you can mow in a way that will either push them all away from the equipment and at least try and get them, not corralled, off to the edge, maybe even there's forest here they could go to. Here they're kind of creating a inward area that's not being cut. So anything on the edge can kind of just move inward. And at the bottom one, it's just the opposite of cutting inward, it's cutting outward and forcing everything out. Which again is great for any species basically that lives in a hayfield that can't get up and fly away immediately, which includes fledgling birds. Cool. I'm gonna take a drink of water quickly. Does anybody have any questions or anything over the ecology? I'm gonna touch on the Blitz and some other stuff more, but I'd love to take any questions now if there are any. Good deal. Great. So, free to unmute. Yes, please do. Cool. So, the thing I'm very, very, very excited about is the 2021 Vermont, New Hampshire, Eastern Meadowlark Blitz. We're teaming up with New Hampshire Audubon. They're taking care of their side of the river. We're taking care of our side. And I'm hoping to get as many people involved as possible. I have 2 main goals for this Blitz. One, raise awareness. Most people that I've talked to aren't aware how fast grassland birds are declining, especially in Vermont. A 8.7% decline annually is insane. That's one of the highest of any species in Vermont. Even higher than grasshopper sparrows. Now that they're so relegated to their 2 sites, they're relatively steady-ish. Meadowlark are just right in the peak of a precipitous decline. So raise awareness, make people more aware of what bird-friendly farming practices are. Ask them to set aside prime areas of habitat, anything like that. And then 2, obviously collect data. eBird, as fantastic of a source for data as it is, I use it daily, obviously. There are issues with it. People can be biased to go to hotspots where people have seen birds before. So we have these spots where, there may only be 2 meadowlarks, but you'll have 100 people go see those 2 meadowlarks, spiking the numbers there, making it look like there's tons and tons of meadowlarks there, but only because people are biased to go there already. And then on the flip side, places that people haven't seen them before, even if they're great habitat, people are not too likely to go find these birds, in the middle of a hayfield that's not a hot spot, just because that's not a place where people, where I guess it's not a place that most people bird, right? Like no one just goes birding along hayfields in the middle of July when it's 90 degrees out at 8 a.m. So we're trying to get rid of that bias by encouraging people to do exactly that. And then also just, better understanding of the meadowlark distribution. And then also through getting a better sense of like management routines, be able to determine prime sites of conservation that will have sustained inhabitants. Barbara, they asked any trends for earlier arrival dates. Not at the moment. I know that one of my, so I did a summer of bobolink research, like nest searches and banding and stuff on Shelburne Farm. And one of my, I went to high school with her and I worked with her for the summer. She did a thesis on the impact of climate change on arrival dates and nesting dates. And I do not believe she found any significant changes. However, that's also a factor of, small population on Shelburne Farm. So it could be regional. We don't know how much longer it's taking for them to get up to Newport, for example. And then also like bobolinks and Savannah sparrows are really the only two viable options we have for a lot of these studies. Because when you're putting out a band on a nestling, you let it fly out and you hope it returns and you can catch it again in your net. Those odds are exceedingly low. And that's when you have a field with 200 200 bobolink on it. Now, when you have a field with 2 nesting meadowlarks on it, the odds of them being, returning to the same field and being recaptured are so low that it's really hard to get good data on those. Same thing with those geolocators that I mentioned that showed the migration pathway for those meadowlarks. In Vermont, as much as I would love to put those out, they're, very expensive pieces of technology, and the odds of recapturing them is all a numbers game. You put out 100 to try and retrieve 5. And if we're only putting out 2 on, the 2 local adults, very, very hard to get data on that. And the same goes with, grasshopper sparrows. Most of the research on them is done in the Midwest because here they're just too rare to get any good data. Upland sandpipers, that's again, Midwest, maybe military bases in like Massachusetts where they have populations. But it's just really hard to get that type of data for a lot of these species, which is unfortunate because I'm sure there are differences that we would see if we had, wider scale data sets. That being said, another great thing of eBird is that people are diligent about recording, the date of first arrival at their field. Say you do own or manage a grassland area. Are you keep track of the first time you see a meadowlark or bobolink or common yellowthroat every year? And over time, like that data can become useful, especially on the large scale that eBird allows data to be collected at. Go back to the Blitz. So the methodology we're hoping to use, or we are going to use, is roadside or trailside surveys from public roads, public trails. Every 0.2 miles, you're going to do a 10-minute point count. So you can park on the side of the road, hop out of your car, 10-minute point count, set the odometer, drive 0.2 miles, basically keep doing that. Or you can walk it out with the eBird app has an internal clock or an internal tracker, and there's plenty of apps for that as well. And then each stationary point is just going to be entered to eBird as a stationary checklist like you would normally. Sorry. The way we're going to divvy it up is into blocks, which I'll show in a couple minutes. But basically in each block, you'll register for a block. I'll get a map like this. The hay is the white. That's all the hay over 10 hectares. And then, we'll talk together about the best way to come up with a survey route. So right here, this is in Middlebury. I'd say I would survey this route, and then I kind of just put the points approximately 0.2 miles everywhere. For things like down here, I'd say don't even bother surveying that. It's such a small area, so little internal area. I just think it's very unlikely that you'd have stuff there. And then additionally, hopefully take notes on the management. So yes, this is hay, and it doesn't seem to be mowed, in the past month. This was hay and it was mowed yesterday. Or, I thought this was hay, but it's actually corn or, beets or something, right? So just taking some notes on the management to be able to find, if this entire area was delay mowed and being mowed bird friendly, this is probably an area where people might want to focus their outreach on. Talk to the landowners, see if there's any land easements, potentially finding a way to help them financially to offset the cost of keeping the fields, not hayed for months longer than they ideally would need to. And I'm hoping that if we can find these populations of meadowlarks that we don't know about, we'll be able to have some leverage, especially if they / when they are listed, to get some good conservation on the ground done to keep these birds on their sites and make sure they can be on their homelands basically for the years to come. Melissa, I really struggle to come up with a mowing strategy that can control problem species. And yes, that's the hardest question I think that people have to deal with, trying to manage for both grassland birds and invasive species and invasive plants. I'm sorry to say that management for each other is the exact opposite. With grassland birds, I'm saying to hay once at the end of the season. As soon as you have wild parsnip, chervil, yellow rattle, you want to cut hard and cut frequently because you don't want to allow them to go to seed. For a lot of these species that they have seeds that may stay viable for 3 years, if you can cut hard and keep them from seeding for 3-4 years, by the time you're delay mowing again, any seeds aren't going to be viable, so they won't knock on wood, they won't take over the field again. And by that time, you'll be able to start managing for the birds more. It's hard because that is, it stinks when you have a field that in the past has been full with birds. And then you're like, actually, I can't, I need to take care of my invasive this year. You have to do it. But in the long run, if you don't take care of the invasives sooner than later, they're going to take over eventually. And by then, it might be too late to stop them. And then the habitat is just no longer usable by grassland birds unless you reseed the entire thing. So, it's unfortunate, but I encourage people to nip that in the bud sooner than later, cutting, 3 times or more a year to keep them from seeding. And then after that, continue back to your grassland work and just delay mow and keep an eye on any invasives. Another thing I'll also mention on invasives is a lot of people have their hay mowed by like a local farmer, and that farmer may hay 20 fields locally. You really want to, it's a lot easier said than done, but ideally you would be hosing off the machine between fields so that if a species like yellow rattle does move in, which is becoming more and more common in Vermont, especially in the upper valley, if you hose it off, knock the seeds off the machinery, it will reduce spreading from your field to another field or vice versa. So, it's not always easy to lug a giant, hose into the middle of a field to wash the tractor off. But I'd say that's probably the best practices. This can, like, just finishing up on the Blitz, some details on where I'm asking people to survey. So the left is the most recent breeding bird atlas. These are all the blocks that have had breeding records in them through that time. This is all the eBird data, past 10 years breeding season. And then this is the Meadowlark Blitz blocks. I'm focusing the blocks in the areas with the most suitable habitat, not necessarily where the most birds have been seen before. Because there's a lot of, there's a lot of blocks here that had breeding meadowlarks in them that just haven't been revisited much since. And if they have been revisited since, they've been revisited once in mid-May and not again. So through, like, visiting these fields 3 times out the year, throughout the summer, we'll have a better sense on what fields are hosting meadowlarks year round, which ones are, providing good breeding habitat, which ones they're migrating through but not stopping at. And then also, again, like areas down like here, like there's been literally not a single record on there in the past decade, but there was breeding activity there during the last breeding bird atlas. So encouraging people to get out to the areas where there's good habitat. There may have been seen some in the past, but they just haven't been seen recently. Trying to get that info on land management. So if they haven't been seen recently, might, have a little bit better of an understanding on that. And just trying to find, places where they breed, but we don't know. And if we don't know where they're breeding, we can't act to conserve those populations at all. So I'm really hoping that some people will, join in. You can go to val.vtecostudies.org, and if you hover over the project tab, click Explore and Join Wildlife Project, and then just click the Blitz. I have a map similar to this on there, where you can just click and sign up for a block, and then probably later this month I'll be I will be contacting everybody, talking about appropriate survey routes. If we have 5 people that sign up for one block and 0 people that sign up for a neighboring block, maybe trying to reallocate some of those effort hours. Please feel free to email me with any questions. I'm more than happy to Zoom in the future. I'm really hoping that we can get a lot of people out there this year. Especially if it's the first year that they are going to be listed, this is the time to get good baseline data, since we just genuinely cannot wait another 10 years to get this data. We can't wait 10 years for it. So please, I encourage you to contact me and consider joining. Even if you're not tracking the land management, anytime you see a meadowlark, please eBird it. Just get the data on there, and I'm really excited to hopefully have some really good involvement, throughout the state, especially in the Champlain Valley, where I think there's the most potential for conservation both in the short and especially in the long term. And then this feeds into my ambassadors program, which I'm going to put a quick plug out. Melissa, you asked that great question about mowing to control for both invasives and grassland birds. I'm more than happy to come to your field and your property to come check it out. That's a very big part of my position, on the ground outreach and conservation. So whether, I know that Otter Creek Audubon has a nice population of meadowlarks somewhere in the fields, or private landowners or conservation commissions, whomever. I'm more than happy to come out, chat with you. I got some fancy grassland management signs made up that, kind of says to people, like, we're not hanging it, like, we don't, just stay out of it. Don't yell to us that you're going to get ticks because of the hay. We're managing it and not cutting it for a reason. So I just like to encourage anyone that does have a grassland field, or 10 acres of meadow, or interested in learning more, to please reach out to me at grasslands@VT Ecostudies. Same with any information about the Blitz. And I'm hoping that this May, June, July, I'll be able to get out check out a lot of people's fields, do some, do a lot of surveys, and just try and make sure that people are feeling more confident in the management and that they're reaching their own management goals while also trying to find a good middle ground for the birds as well. And then I'll just end it on the VCE slide. We have tons of volunteer projects ranging with everything from butterflies to lady beetles to vernal pools. This summer I want you guys all to myself, but in subsequent summers, just in case you're looking for more volunteer opportunities. Yeah, that's basically like the gist of the project. I'd love to take any questions or anything that you may not be sure about or I didn't explain clear enough. This is my first presentation on this project, so I'm sure there are some clarifying points that people may have. So I'm more than happy to talk about that at all. If not, I'll probably just go. We can look at some of the local grassland maps for the Addison County area. And feel free to unmute and video or chat questions.
Kevin, this is Amy Douglas. How many blocks are there in Shoreham and Orwell and Bridport? Do you know that, or?
I can get that to you in just 1 second. I'm just gonna discard. Yeah, I got my I have a pretty nice map I've made myself to kind of answer questions like that. So just let me get that up. Cool. So this is all those, all the sightings. So these are all the Blitz blocks. And so, I mean, basically the entirety of Addison is covered, which is going to be daunting to get done. So, it'll be interesting to see. But the darker blue blocks are what I'm calling the high priority. I should put my hay layer on. So all the yellow is hay, basically. So within each block, I quantified the amount of hay, and using that, I kind of I assigned priority, high priority, priority, or low priority. So areas with a ton of grasslands are going to be the highest priority. Then in places like this with Snake Mountain, still good amount of grasslands, but not a whole ton. So that's just regular priority. And then the low priority are places where, it's, you have 1 or 2 large fields that might be worth checking out, but definitely aren't places to focus a lot of your energy.
And what size are those blocks? Excuse me.
They're about 9 square miles. They're 3 by 3.
Okay,
yeah.
miles.
Yeah. And when I put on, the Vermont eBird and cool. So now all these orange blocks are the most recent survey, the most recent breeding bird survey. So wait for it all. So there's a lot of areas where there are blocks. And then when I put the eBird sightings, there's a lot of blocks, even throughout, the Addison County area that's so heavily agriculture and has so many great birders in it. There's still areas that haven't been surveyed, or at least haven't had recorded meadowlarks for 10 plus years. So I'm hoping that, through this, we really get people to, go check out these areas that either weren't part of the breeding bird atlas, just due to the methodology, or haven't been reported most recently. Like here we have, these the bigger the circle means the more observations from eBird, basically. So here we have the Otter Creek Audubon field and tons of observations from there. Does that mean that there's more meadowlarks here than over here? Probably not. It's just kind of the bias of people visiting the same spots they've seen birds before. And so obviously we want people to bird this and we want to conserve it. But if we don't know if there's birds over here, we could be conserving a meta population of 50 fields more so than the smaller scale conservation. Because when they look for their, for suitable habitat, they are looking at a large land scale point of view. So I'm hoping that like both through like the eBird data and the known populations, hopefully chiseling out a couple unreported or unknown populations will give us a better ability to manage on the landscape scale, not just the smaller local scale.
So,
I'll turn those blocks back on. Sorry, what were you saying?
So if you had a one block with 3 miles, and every 0.2 miles you do a 10-minute thing.
Yeah.
So there's about 15 stops if you had a road all the way through.
In theory, yes. And this is going to be another odd thing about how regional this is, right? If you're trying to survey this block here, let me just turn on all survey blocks. So if I'm just trying to survey, this block by myself, I'm going to be doing a lot of point counts. I'd probably try and do one along this major road and one along this road or this diagonal road. So these are the blocks I would not assume, ask, expect, or necessarily want one person tackling by themselves, right? That's not fair to anyone. But on fields outside of Champlain Valley, which like how regional a lot of these species are, you go down to this Wallingford block, you'd probably do like this road, which would be 4 stops, maybe this one, which would be 2 stops, and that's a much less time intensive. So depending on the region and the type of block, with how much grassland, the layout and the configuration, routes are going to look different. And so that's why I'm hoping that people will register. I'm hoping before the end of April, and then I'm going to take everyone who's registered. Say you have 3 people signed up for. You have 3 people signed up for this Shoreham block here. Shoot an email, talk like, okay, like it's probably best one person does this route and one person does this route and one person does this, and try and make it so one person isn't, responsible for 9 square miles of hayfield, right?
Yeah.
So like that, and again, like this is all, a big part of this is just awareness in general. So even if you volunteer and you can only do this small section here, that's still 5 point counts of data, 50 minutes times 3 over the course of the year. That's over 2 hours of survey time in an area that would have had 0 survey time. And when we're looking at effort hours, that's what a lot of the eBird stuff comes down to, is effort hours per location. And some blocks just have no effort hours. Definitely well outside of your range. But last Breeding Bird Atlas, we did have records up here in, wait for it to load. We had records here in Essex County in 3 blocks. Not many people are going up to this corner of Essex County to bird these hayfields, right? That's just not. If you go into Essex County, you're going to Island Pond, or you're going to Sylvial. Like, no, you're not going to go try and bird this one bend of the Connecticut River. So it is really about just trying to get people out to bird new spots and just crowdsource as much of that as possible. And I'm eager to work with people to make sure that they can participate in whatever way they really want to, even if it's just someone emailing me, hey, I saw a meadowlark at this road. Cool, I'll pop that on eBird for you. If someone wants to go and cover the entire Grand Isle, I'm not going to stop them. So I really, it really is, I'm trying to keep it like a, not low key because there's the protocol, but a fun summer long thing that's not going to be like a killer time sink and a drag.
Kevin, Ken is asking, what's the date range for surveying, and do the routes need to be surveyed multiple times?
Yes. So we're hoping to start in mid-May. That's kind of right at the beginning of their breeding survey. And we're hoping that each route will be surveyed 3 times, May, June, and July. This, will both help with our detection probability. If you're only visiting once, there's a chance you're gonna miss birds just because they're not singing at that moment, or they're, incubating or whatever. And then also, in theory, there's the possibility. That's a lot of pre-qualifiers there. But I'm hoping that if we have robust enough data, we might be able to get a sense of detection probability. If we have a large field like this, and someone surveys it, and there's a meadowlark that's right here, and they do 1, 2, 3 stops, and they only detect it on 1 stop, you can get data from that of it's missed in surveys X% of time, which can help us actually make more meaningful estimates and predictions on their distribution and their numbers and their trends. That's a big if, because that's by no means the point of this project. However, the data would be good to have if we can have it, and we might be able to work with it to make better models for trends and population. Pull up the chat. Yes, Sue, thanks for mentioning that. I do have a eBird account for this project. I guess I have a general eBird account for all of VC's grassland work. It's just grasslands, one word. If you could share any of these checklists with that account, that'd be great. Of course, I can just do a download dump of all the data from the state at the end of the season, but it's nice to have it on the account so I have a better sense of effort hours and stuff like that. And that's all, it's all on the website. And I'm hoping that before the season officially starts, I'll be able to at least chat, at least over email, with anyone that wants to learn more, and I'm eager for that. Yeah, I mean, if you have any for this, I mean, so you mean in 2021 between New Year's and now? I mean, ideally, yeah, that's gonna tell us more about. I said probably tell us more about migration timing than necessary distribution. But I mean, I'm not going to tell someone not to add data to eBird. That's I feel like that's half of VC's job, is telling people to add data to eBird. So I'm not going to tell you not to. But I'm mostly just eager for the breeding season, mid-May into July, which of course is going to look different. Breeding season for you is going to look different than up at Newport, right? Like just the timing is going to be weeks off.
All right.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. I hope that went well. I know it's always nice to talk about these things, though. I appreciate the time and everyone chiming in.
All right. So thanks everyone for viewing in, and as Kevin said, there's information on his website, and we'll be throughout the summer trying to get some information out through our social media stuff and trying to help recruit some people to do this stuff. So I hope if you guys are interested, you'll definitely sign up and help out.
Yeah.
All right. So
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, please do. And again, if you or anyone else has grassland, shoot me an email. I'm more than eager to help you with management or connect you with the right people for that, whether it be UVM extension or whoever else. So,
all right.
Please keep me in the loop.
Thank
All
you,
right, thanks,
Kevin.
Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.